The Americas Zone and the Global Common Channel of the Singapore Fintech Festival. I'm Glenn Van Zutphen. Our next session will be a two-parter on climate change and the financial sector's response. The first part will be a fireside chat moderated by Greg Watson. He's the lead specialist of the Inter-American Development Bank's Natural Cital Division. Now, he will be in conversation with Dr. Thomas Lovejoy, president of the Amazon Biodiversity Center, and Dr. Virgilio Viana, Director General of Sustainable Amazon Foundation. To pose questions to the panel, click on the yellow button that's beneath the session window. Let's get started now with the first part of this session and join Greg, Dr. Lovejoy, and Dr. Viana.
Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here with this audience talking about a topic that may be new and different for you. I understand this is the first time we're talking about the Amazon in this event. We're really honored to have two amazing speakers with us today, both who have spent significant time in the Amazon. One, Virgilio, who's there right now in Manaus, coming from the field, and Tom Lovejoy, who probably wishes that he was in the Amazon right now. I'll give a very brief introduction. My name is Greg Watson. I'm the leader of the Natural Capital Lab program at the Inter-American Development Bank, which seeks to promote financial and technological innovation in the conservation of biodiversity. We also have with us Tom Lovejoy, who is commonly referred to as the godfather of biodiversity. He's an innovative conservation biologist. He created the term biological diversity in 1980 and has been working in the Amazon since then. He also has edited several books. He's received several awards, and he's an inspiration to those of us in the field of biodiversity, and we're really honored to have him here today. As I mentioned, Professor Virgilio Viana is actually coming to us from Manaus, Brazil. He's one of Brazil's leading experts on forestry, environment, and sustainable development. He was Brazil's Secretary of State for Environment and Sustainable Development and is currently the director of the Amazonas Sustainability Foundation. They work on implementing programs nationally as well as on innovation in the Amazon ecosystem. So with that, let's turn to the topic of the conversation, which is the Amazon biome. It's under threat. World Wildlife Fund estimates that 27%, more than a quarter of the biome, will be without trees by 2030 if the current rate of deforestation continues. Frequently, I think there's a false dichotomy that we make where we think that economic growth and ecosystem health can't happen at the same time. This panel will really talk about some of the drivers of why are we seeing deforestation in the Amazon, what are some of the potential solutions, and what is the role of innovation, finance, and entrepreneurship in that field. We're starting to see the realigning of interests of markets, people, and planet, and the SDG framework of the UN is something that I think many of us are guided by that is actually showing the way forward on some of these topics. And so without further ado, I'm going to turn to first talk a bit with Tom. Tom, you are one of the most renowned scientists working in the Amazon in the world, and you've recently published research suggesting that the Amazon is reaching a tipping point where ecosystem degradation enters into a vicious cycle that has wide-ranging effects for the South American continent and for the world that depends on products coming from South America. Can you describe the state of the Amazon today and the essential services that it provides?
So the Amazon was the first place that scientists actually understood the role of trees and leaves in essentially hydrological cycles. And it turns out that the Amazon makes half of its own rainfall. The moisture that comes off the tropical Atlantic and drops as rain is both evaporated and transpired through the leaves and recycles about 5 or 6 times crossing the basin. So we always thought that was an important issue and too much deforestation could affect it. We now know, to begin with, that the hydrological cycle provides moisture not only to the Amazon forest, but also to every country in South America except Chile. It is tied in to the continental climate system. And we first estimated, maybe 40, 50% deforestation would be the time when it would be really bad for the forest. But other things are happening now, like climate change and extensive use of fire. And the three have a negative synergy. And particularly in the south and east of the Amazon, that is actually showing the first signs of tipping into a savanna-like vegetation, a much drier climate with major loss of biodiversity and huge impacts for the people who live there. And of course, a major amount of carbon going into the atmosphere. And so, we're right at the cusp. The tipping doesn't happen, just like something falling over. It takes a while. So the good news is that conscientious efforts at reforestation, some of which Brazil has already obligated itself to, can actually build back that margin of safety. And
Tom, maybe just to jump on that question for a second, because you've talked a little bit about what's happening. What could be some of the impacts for the South American continent and for the world from reaching this tipping point?
So if the Amazon is not managed as the system, it will cause that hydrological cycle to degrade dramatically. So there'll be less rainfall for agriculturalists in central Brazil, even in northern Argentina. And when you have the tipping point in the conversion of vegetation from the incredibly biodiverse tropical rainforest to a much less biodiverse savanna, basically you will have lost some of the real treasures of the Amazon and also created an environment which is not suited for the people who are living there. So it's not just what happens in Brazil, of course. There are 8 countries that are part of that Amazon system, and all are tied up in that hydrological cycle. So going forward, what we're talking about is how can we have an economy and a vision that allows those countries to manage it as a system.
That's really interesting. And I would assume that some of the production that would be affected in many of the countries are actually important products that are exported to other places and actually to Asia and other countries, the North American continent, that actually could have quite an important impact on corporates that have supply chains that reach to the South American continent too. So it's not just, I think we focus a lot, and I think rightly so, on the ecological and the livelihoods impacts in the field itself, but also thinking about how these kind of create systemic risks for producers and for financial institutions who have invested in those producers is an interesting impact that many people don't think about. I'm going to switch to Virgilio for a couple of minutes to ask a bit about what's happening in the field. You're in Manaus, you're in the Amazon. You work at the community level across the Amazon, conserving forests, creating income, and sparking innovation. What do you think the role of innovation is to develop a sustainable economy in the Amazon and a future for this region?
Well, thank you, Greg. Just as a way of linking to Tom's perspective, the Amazon, in my view, is too big to fail. The Amazon is vital to maintain Brazil's food exports to Asia. So I think this is really an issue of global relevance. In terms of innovation, I think there is a great need for innovation, but not necessarily the same kind of innovation that people are used to think. And people usually think of the Silicon Valley as IT solutions that are going to transform reality. And yes, of course, these are very important, but we need different sorts of innovations in the Amazon. And some of them are very specific. the Amazon not only has this richness that Tom mentioned in terms of biodiversity, it also has a wealth of knowledge associated with cultural diversity. We have hundreds of different ethnical groups, indigenous groups, that have a fantastic knowledge on medicinal plants, on how to use different foods that come from forests. And we need an innovation that creates bridges between this traditional knowledge and also modern technology. We need innovative solutions in terms of finance, because we have different kinds of production systems that conventional financing instruments with the commercial banks are not very well suited for. So we need innovative finance mechanisms for the Amazon bioeconomy. And I wrote a definition of Amazon bioeconomy last year to facilitate the debate that we're not talking about bioeconomy in general, which includes soybeans and sugarcane. We're talking about the bioeconomy associated with biodiversity, and that's what we call Amazon bioeconomy. And there are many innovation challenges to put these biodiversity into the markets. And why to do that? For basically two reasons. The first reason is that we have to make forests worth more standing than cut, so that this becomes a disincentive for deforestation. People deforest not because they're stupid. They deforest in order to generate financial returns. So if we are able and to make forests worth more standing than cut, that can be a very important ally to reduce deforestation. And that's one area that we have several good examples, and this provides us room for hope that things can change.
Thanks. Let's dig down on that a little bit. I mean, in the program that I work in at the IDB, we did an analysis and found that one of the key challenges was actually providing risk capital to entrepreneurs, because there were a lot of programs that were getting businesses that actually do what you're saying, make the forest worth more standing than cut, get them to a certain stage, but they needed $500,000, $400,000 of early stage equity, convertible financial instruments that then would bridge them to then attracting $1 million investment from one of the investment funds that's interested in this space. And that really was lacking. At the IDB, we've just recently with IDB Lab created a facility to actually provide that kind of financing. But I wonder if you have any thoughts about kind of the role of entrepreneurs and entrepreneurship in this space.
Yes, I think the initiatives that IDB is implementing are very positive. I think the idea of providing risk capital is a very good one. I would add that we also need to support very small entrepreneurs as well. Taking the slogan of leaving no one behind, we have to consider that the Amazon has a big social challenge in terms of poverty and inequity. So microfinance is also very important. And we currently at the Foundation for Amazon Sustainability, the organization that I currently lead, is implementing a program focused on small scale finance. Just to give an example, a small producer of acai can turn his or her own production with $10,000 and make a big difference in terms of scaling up and accessing the markets. So we have to think of, generally speaking, three scales: micro, and we're talking about $10,000 to $50,000, then medium, which is $200,000 to $600,000, and then large, which is from $1 to $10 million. So we need and we have opportunities for financing at these three levels, and we have to focus on training local human capital. I'm a strong advocate of education for Amazon peoples. We have a large number of young individuals who are ready to become entrepreneurs, who are eager to become entrepreneurs. And one of the things that we're doing that is fantastic is an education program that lasts 1 year for kids that have finished high school. And at the end of this 1 year, they write business plans on the base of bioeconomy. And then we're providing them these small scale finance from $10,000 to $50,000. And that's the very bottom of the pyramid.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm very strong advocate of this kind of approach.
And then I guess this leads to a question for both of you. This is a fintech conference. There's a lot of fintech providers in the audience. Have you seen any interesting applications of financial technology? Because this is a very remote region, and actually accessibility, it can be a challenge. Traditional banking solutions may not reach to the people who we're trying to reach, and this financing challenge that you just mentioned, Virgilio. So have either of you seen really interesting examples of using fintech so far in the region? Or if you would rather, kind of, where do you really wish that the fintech world would go in terms of providing solutions in the Amazon? And Tom, why don't I start with you, and then we'll turn to Virgilio.
So thank you for that question, and I totally support Virgilio's view of what needs to be done for the people who are living in the Amazon, because without them, there is no solution. These people have spent centuries and millennia learning about the forest and useful things in the forest. And some of those can actually become a major export product. And the acai fruits that Virgilio mentioned are a good example of that. Another example would be aquaculture, just absolutely amazing, delicious fish that grow in the Amazon. And there is successful aquaculture, but it's very spotty. It's here and there. And so thinking about how you could actually join some of those efforts together and essentially create an export market for the entire world is not that hard to do. It just needs to be done. And so beyond that, and many of the wonderful examples that are hidden away in the biodiversity that can transform biological sciences and do things like create the ACE inhibitors, which people use around the world to control their high blood pressure, which did come from the Amazon. There's just a wealth of possibilities there.
And on that, I guess what you mentioned with the aquaculture example, which I think is a really interesting one, you need technology to do traceability to make sure that those products are coming from sustainable aquaculture. You would need technology and fintech to finance those operations, and that could be a really interesting area for some future work. Virgilio, I'll ask you the same question. Where do you really think, have you seen really great fintech happening in the region, or is there something that is on your wish list to see fintech try to solve a problem?
I think both. I think there are interesting initiatives already that have happened on the ground, but I think there is there are a number of things in my wish list. If you think of fintechs as providers of loans or crowdfunding or payments or investment, I think there are many opportunities to be explored. And just to give you and the audience a sense of the kind of challenge that we have, imagine a place. Imagine that if you're in DC, now, like I'm in Manaus. Manaus is maybe comparable to DC in terms of the size. We have 2 million population here. And imagine traveling 2 weeks by boat to get to a remote community. 2 weeks, day and night, breakfast, lunch, dinner, and then you reach to one of those places. These are places where we work at FAS. So imagine making a payment. Imagine receiving a loan or attracting crowdfunding. It's a huge challenge. The good news is that we're making some very significant breakthroughs. First, in terms of creating a combination of solar energy and internet access. So connectivity is now on the way. That is one of the legacies, the positive legacy of the pandemic. We were able to raise significant funding, and we're implementing 100 of those stations with internet and solar energy scattered throughout the forests. And the same facility can be used for fintechs to provide these financial services in areas where nothing could happen of this nature before. So this is in my wish list to add to this public health strategy that has been built on the basis of funding available through COVID, through the pandemic, available to fintech solutions and innovations. So I think there's a great set of opportunities there. We at FAS, we have done a number of initiatives of providing microcredit, running from 2,000 reais, something like $400, all the way to 10,000. So this kind of funding makes a huge difference on people's livelihoods, on all different kinds of activities. So I think there is appetite locally for entrepreneurs to engage in different kinds of partnerships. These new entrepreneurs are open and interested in different blend financing mechanisms. I think we have to combine grant money with investment, with equities or loans or returnable investments. So I'm really positive that this is a field that can make a huge contribution. And again, why? To make forests worth more standing and cut. That is the crux of the problem. We have to harness financial resources to invest in the forest, because right now what we have is the opposite. A lot of funding going to soybeans and cattle farming and other kinds of deforestation related activities. So we now have to develop a huge investment flow into forest conservation economy. And that's, I think, the synthesis of the challenge that I see for fintechs in the Amazon.
And I think also about the role of technology in both monitoring what's happening with the forest, right? I mean, that happens already, but we're seeing initiatives. We're working on one at IDB where, because we're talking a lot about kind of the smaller scale of investment here, but these businesses eventually grow and need to attract larger scale finance. And there are these large investment funds that, you know, HSBC has announced $1 billion fund for climate and biodiversity. The Morova funds are quite established and invest in this space, but they have a hard time finding the projects that they can invest those $1 million tickets in. And, you know, how we're starting to look at applications of artificial intelligence, of big data, to be able to actually start to, if we have technology platforms where these projects are visible, where we can use these tools to actually start to aggregate them so that they become of a size that's actually attractive to investors. And I think that's another really interesting place for technology in this whole area. Besides the fact of, you know, we haven't spent much time talking about it, but the use of technology actually, you know, in pharmaceuticals and the like, where that come from these products, you know, making sure that the benefits are actually provided to the local communities that have been the stewards of these resources for generations. But these can actually become quite important and big business. We have time, I think, for one more question for both of you. Before we close, and the question I'd like to ask is, let's say that we get this right, that we begin to get the fintechs in the right area, we begin to create the value chains that we need. What is your vision for what the Amazon could look like in 10 or 15 years if we can kind of change the economic model from one of deforestation and extraction to one based on bioeconomy? What do you think that looks like? Let's start with you, Tom.
So I think it would include a lot of communities, like the one that Virgilio had a lot to do with getting going in the Rio Negro Sustainable Development Reserve, where they actually still use harvest from traditional sources, but they're connected by broadband to the rest of the world and not interested in going to the big city. It's really fascinating. And I think another thing that's going to be important here is to figure out what the secret would be to create sustainable cities in the Amazon, in which the economic opportunity is not destructive of the surrounding forest, but has a quality of life for the people who live there. And there's special tax incentives that make Manaus an exception, but basically as the economic productivity of Manaus has grown, the amount of deforestation in the state has declined. So what that says is Virgilio's vision of building the economy in ways that doesn't destroy the forest actually works.
So Virgilio, that's a great chance. We've got 3 minutes left. So if you want to take 2 minutes and just tell us what does that vision look like in 15 years?
Well, I have a very similar view to Tom's. I think we have to divide, generally speaking, in two large visions. First is a vision for communities. And I think we should aim for poverty or extreme poverty-free Amazon. I learned from Nelson Mandela once in South Africa that the biggest enemy of conservation is extreme poverty. So if you're threatened by existence or your kid, your children, you kill an elephant to buy food for your children who is hungry. So we have to add a social component to the strategy of conservation and prosperity. So prosperity is one. And we have many cases already that things are happening in this direction. Tom mentioned one in the Rio Negro. I'd like to invite you and others of the audience to come over and visit near Manaus. The Chancellor of the Vatican, Marcelo Sanchez Orondo, says that it's the view that comes closest to Pope Francis' idea of Laudato Si. So that's very encouraging to us. And then you have the agenda of sustainable cities that Tom also mentioned. I think that there's a great investment opportunity in Manaus to become a sort of a global center for innovation on forest technologies, for pharmaceuticals, for dyes, natural dyes, for superfoods, and for beauty products in general. So I think we could envision, and maybe that's a challenge for IDP and for you to finish, maybe we can come up with such a big vision. We need a financial institution that provides the resources to make Manaus a sort of a center to irradiate industries of this sort. And I'm very, not optimistic, but I'm hopeful, as Pope Francis encouraged us to be.
Thanks, Virgilio. And just closing here, I think I totally agree with everything you've both said about sustainable cities, the potential for Manaus as a hub, and also about the poverty and social aspects of this. And as we start to see COVID recovery packages coming from governments. Getting this, we have a once in a generation opportunity to get this right, where we can align recovery packages, economic stimulus with sustainable business. And so that could be a whole separate conversation that we can have someday over some acai in the middle of the Amazon, hopefully. And I really want to thank you both for being here and for providing this audience a little glimpse into the challenges and the opportunities in the Amazon. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Greg, for leading that discussion with Dr. Lovejoy and Dr. Viana on climate impact and the Amazon.